Academic neurosurgeon Dr. Eben Alexander, whose career includes decades as a physician and associate professor at Harvard Medical School, was once staunchly committed to the materialistic worldview, the belief that the physical world is all that exists. His scientific belief system was altered by his 2008 transcendental near-death experience, an odyssey into another realm during a week-long coma. Since his NDE, Dr. Alexander has been reconciling his rich spiritual experience with quantum physics, cosmology, and the philosophy of mind. His books, Proof of Heaven, The Map of Heaven, and Living in a Mindful Universe, are available in more than 40 countries. Since his NDE, Dr. Alexander has dedicated himself to sharing information about near-death experiences, what they teach us about consciousness, and the nature of reality. He continues to promote further research on the unifying elements of science and spirituality. Eben has spoken for us numerous times and been on a number of our panels. We're really excited to welcome you back. And Jeffrey Mishlove, this is his debut with the Vail Symposium, but we hope that you'll come back and share your knowledge and experience with our community for many more programs as well. Jeffrey is the host and producer of the New Thinking Aloud channel on YouTube. He's the author of The Roots of Consciousness, Psi Development Systems, and the PK Man. He's the recipient of the only doctoral diploma in parapsychology ever awarded by an accredited university, the University of California at Berkeley, of all places. Surprise, surprise, right? Between 1986 and 2002, he hosted and co-produced the original Thinking Aloud public television series, and he is recently the first prize winner of the 2021 Bigelow Institute essay competition regarding the best evidence for survival of human consciousness after permanent bodily death. Jeffrey's going to come up and get things started, then he will invite Eben to come up and join him in conversation, and then we'll turn it over to you for questions. Jeffrey? You're on?
Yep. I trust it's on. Yeah, great. If you have had an experience that gave you a sense you were in contact with the afterlife, would you raise your hands? I would say it's about 20% of the audience. And for those of you who have had such an experience, if you felt that it changed your life in some way, would you raise your hands? At least half of the first group of people. I see that we're exploring or celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Vail Symposium. I had an experience 50 years ago of the afterlife that changed my life permanently. If you had known me in 1972, you would have seen a graduate student in criminology. I was volunteering at the psychiatric unit of San Quentin Prison, conducting group therapy sessions with murderers and rapists. And that's when, to my surprise, I had the most powerful dream of my life. Neither before nor since have I had anything like it. It turned out that my great-uncle Harry had died on a Sunday morning. He lived in Wisconsin. I was a college student in California. It was about 7:30 in the morning. I'm still in bed. Uncle Harry came to me in my dream. He talked to me deeply about my life. It was one of those experiences, you've heard this probably 100 times from people like Eben Alexander and other near-death experiencers who say it was more real than our normal sensory experiences on the physical plane. He touched me. It was a soul-to-soul communication, and it was so powerful that when I awakened from the dream, I was crying tears of joy. I was just sobbing. And at the same time singing one of the very most sacred songs in the entire liturgy of my own Jewish religious tradition. There's a song from World War I. It was very popular. How do you keep them down on the farm once they've seen Gay Paris? And you can imagine, how could I continue working at San Quentin prison, preparing for a career in criminology, after I'd had such a powerful taste of the afterlife? It moved me to want to make a major career shift. And I struggled and agonized over that for months, because it's easy at any university to study psychopathology or crime. But if you want to study intuition, mysticism, life after death, psychic abilities, there were virtually no opportunities. I had talked to my professors about my experience to see if they had anything intelligent to say, and none of them did, which is why I resolved I was going to have to, if I wanted to understand what had just happened to me, I would have to become my own expert. And over a period of many months, I found a few faculty members who would sponsor me. Well, I'll share with you very briefly, I was guided by dreams. Since one of you came up to me earlier and asked about dreams and the relationship of dreams in the afterlife. As in my experience, the realm of dreams intersects with the afterlife. And I had resolved I was going to do something different. Instead of studying the negative side of human deviance, crime and psychopathology, I wanted to shift to the positive side. And I had a dream one night. The dream, not only did I have the dream, I knew before I went to bed the answer was going to come in a dream. And this is after months of agonizing. I'll just go through it quickly because I don't want to deviate too much from the story about the afterlife, but they're related. I dreamt that I was visiting some friends of mine in Berkeley. I knocked on their apartment door. No answer. In the dream, I found the key to their apartment, walked in, and on the middle of their living room floor was a magazine in the dream named EYE. I was paging through this magazine in my dream when I woke up with this feeling of exhilaration, like I had the answer, I knew what to do, but I had no idea what it meant. So I acted out the dream. I put on my tennis shoes. I ran 5 miles across town to this particular apartment, knocked on the door, no answer. And then I knew where they kept the key, under the doormat. I let myself into the apartment, walked into their living room, and there, smack dab in the middle of the living room floor, was a magazine. I picked it up and started paging through it, just as I had in the dream, and discovered it was the magazine of nonprofit, listener-sponsored radio and television in the San Francisco Bay Area. It was called Focus. And that magazine literally brought focus to my life, because if you had known me then, you would have seen a long-haired hippie. I didn't own a radio or a television set. I didn't believe in electronic communication. I thought the only authentic communication was face-to-face. Everything else was phony baloney. And I changed my mind at that moment. I went over to the nonprofit radio station in Berkeley, California, KPFA, Pacifica Radio, and volunteered. And even though I had my master's degree at that time, they said to me, sit at this desk, and when you hear this buzzer, push this button and let people in the front door. And I was happy to do that. I was grateful for the opportunity, and within 3 weeks, I had learned how to produce radio programs. I did a program on you don't have to be from out of town to be psychic. And the program director liked it, and he said, we've got a regular slot for you every Tuesday and Thursday at noon on a program called The Mind's Ear. And all of a sudden, within weeks of having had the dream, I found myself sitting at a table with world-class experts in all the topics that I loved the most, who were passing through San Francisco on their book tours. That gave me the confidence to go back to the university and take advantage of an obscure rule they had, which is if you're already a graduate student in good standing and you want to do a dissertation on a topic that no department will sponsor, but you can find 3 faculty members from different departments who will sponsor you. You can then create your own doctoral degree. And I did that in parapsychology. That's how I happened to hold this unique degree. And the important point for tonight is that I can look back now, 50 years later, and say that moment, that episode, those 2 dreams permanently changed my life. And that's one of the key features of people who encounter the afterlife. I think one might say with Eben Alexander, your life was permanently changed. And in my essay for the Bigelow Institute competition, I listed a few others. It doesn't always happen for people that your life is permanently changed. You have to be primed for it. It has to occur at a time in your life when you can make a permanent change. But it happened, for example, to Bishop James Pike. He was the Episcopal Bishop of California, a very prominent, powerful position. If you lived in San Francisco, the big cathedral there on Nob Hill is Grace Cathedral, and that was his cathedral. And he was renowned because he was an outspoken liberal and taking on all of the conservatives within the Episcopalian Church on issues like abortion and all the popular issues, anti-war and so on. And he had a close relationship with his son Jim. They were living together in England, where he was teaching at Cambridge in England, and they spent 3 weeks together in an apartment. His son, who was a college student at the time, went back to New York and ended his life by suicide in a hotel room in New York. Bishop Pike was absolutely distraught, as you can imagine, and began, discussing the situation with his Anglican colleagues who he was with, and a series of poltergeist experiences began occurring in the very apartment that he had shared with his son just days earlier. In fact, he counted 50 different episodes, and he's discussing this, with his religious colleagues, and they suggested, the Episcopal Church has a close relationship, or the Anglican Church, as it's called in England, close relationship with the spiritualists in England. And in a particular spiritualist medium was very highly regarded amongst the Anglicans. And her name was Ina Twigg. And one of the church officials arranged for Bishop Pike to have a seance. Not really a seance, a reading with Ina Twigg. And in that reading, in which the church official, who was named Canon Pierce Higgins, incidentally, took notes and was there, Bishop Pike's son came through in great detail. They had a lengthy conversation about the poltergeist experiences and about how, the pressure the son was under that caused him to end his life by suicide. And not only that, it turned out that his son Jim's godfather, who had been Bishop Pike's close friend, was the famous theologian Paul Tillich, who had also died. And Paul Tillich came through in the very same mediumistic session. And Bishop Pike held other sessions with other mediums in the United States, with multiple other mediums, and his son Jim would come through those mediums as well, to his satisfaction that he was having an authentic communication with his son. Well, you can imagine how this was received by the Episcopalian community in the United States. It's not part of their doctrine. They're not spiritualists. Bishop Pike wrote a book about all of this called The Other Side, and he resigned as Bishop of California. He realized he couldn't continue as bishop any longer. He had two ambitions. One of them was to continue to explore spiritualism, and his other ambition was to probe the mysteries of the origins of Christianity. And he was in Israel doing just that, trying to trace the actual life of Jesus when he was lost in the desert. Many of you may remember back in 1967 when he died. Ina Twigg was consulted. There was a period when Bishop Pike was lost in the desert, and Ina Twigg was consulted and actually described the very circumstances that led to his death, climbing up a cliff in the desert and falling to his death. So one might say his life was permanently changed in a major way when he resigned the exalted position of Bishop of California, but then he didn't live very long after that. Another example of an individual whose life was permanently changed by contact with the afterlife. It's a very dramatic example. I imagine most of you know the name Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was regarded as one of the most influential women of the 20th century for her work on the stages of grieving, death and dying. And she was also one of the very first people to write about the near-death experience. It turns out, though, that she went through a crisis in her life. It was so serious that she wanted to give up all of this work. She was ready and about to announce, she was at the University of Chicago at the time, about to announce to the minister that she was working with it, she's quitting, she's giving it up. Her seminars, she felt, were unsuccessful. She thought this is a wrong direction for her. And she's standing by the elevator about to tell this minister, I'm quitting, when all of a sudden, a woman appeared and said, may I walk with you to your office from the elevator? So she was pulled away from that minister where she was going to resign. And as they're walking toward the office, she recognizes the woman. This woman, Mrs. Schwartz, was the very woman who had first talked to her about the near-death experience some 10 months ago. However, Mrs. Schwartz had died subsequently. And here she was in the flesh, walking with her down the hall. They got to her office, they walked into her office, and Mrs. Schwartz looked at her and said, you must not quit. Promise me that you will not quit. Now, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross looked at her, and she describes in a book she wrote about this experience. It was one of those experiences where she felt they melded telepathically, that Mrs. Schwartz looked at her and saw into her soul, and she knew it. And she, like the experience I had with Uncle Harry. And she had enough presence of mind to ask Mrs. Schwartz, would you mind writing a note for me and signing it? Mrs. Schwartz did, wrote the note and signed it, gave it to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and walked out the door of her office. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross took a look out the door down the hallway, there was no one there. But she kept her promise, and she ended up, as we've said, to become one of the most influential women of the 20th century as a result. So that experience is both a life-changing experience and an experience of full-bodied spirit materialization. I regard those kinds of evidences, for myself. I have no doubt when I look back and say 50 years ago I had an experience of the afterlife that permanently changed me. And so when I read about Bishop Pike and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Eben Alexander, I have no doubt of the authenticity of what they're claiming. And one of the intriguing things is this. As you can see from this diagram, there's a ton of evidence for the afterlife. It comes, as I've explained in this diagram, from at least 9 different independent directions. Lines of research, some of which have been investigated, in fact, some of which have been investigated for over 150 years, and even the recent ones, like near-death experiences and reincarnation, for 50 years now, we have mountains of evidence. And yet, if you haven't had a personal experience yourself, we live in such a materialistic culture. It's natural to be skeptical. It's natural to doubt. It's natural to think, I don't know for sure. I'm waiting for proof of a scientific nature. I think we will gradually, slowly move closer and closer to that proof. I can talk briefly about these 9 different areas of evidence. I'm sure you can appreciate. I don't have time to go into the kind of detail that the essay I wrote for the Bigelow Institute competition, which is 100 pages, went into it. But let's just talk about a few of them. Reincarnation. There are in the archives at the University of Virginia, Department of Psychiatry, over 2,700 cases of young children who, as soon as they are able to talk, usually around the age of 2, 3, 4, they start describing their past life memories. I used to live in a different village. I had different parents. You're not my real parents, sometimes they will say. And they will give detailed evidence. And the intriguing thing is that in the best of these cases, researchers can come on the scene, collect all that information that the child is giving, and then go about researching to find out if it makes sense. And it turns out that today there are approximately 1,700 cases that are regarded as solved. And a solved case means that the information provided by the child actually results in identifying the previous person that they say they were. And some of these are very dramatic. The young children are not saying, like, I'm watching a movie about this other person. No, they're saying, it was me. It was my experience. I had that experience. And they can often report it with great emotion. And furthermore, a very interesting thing, most of these cases, well, an extraordinarily high number, I think it's 40% of these cases are ones in which the previous person died violently, which is unusual. And of greatest interest is that in many of these cases, it's been documented according to medical records, the death wounds of the previous person correspond to birthmarks of the young children. So it's as if not only do the memories survive, the sense of identity survives, but actual physical features are found, and personality traits are found. And Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, who was chair of the psychiatry department when he began this research, points out that it's actually valuable from a psychotherapeutic perspective, that this information is very useful, for example, in understanding phobias that can occur. Very often, the young children will have phobias associated with the manner of death of the previous person, and other kinds of personality characteristics as well are very strong. One of the things that the research shows, for example, is that contrary to the view that we have of karma, if you behave badly in one lifetime, you're going to be punished for it in your next lifetime in some way or another. The research doesn't support that at all. But what the research does support is that certain traits, certain habits, certain tendencies carry over. If you were a particular type of person in one lifetime, you'll have a similar personality in the next lifetime. And one person, my friend Walter Semke, a medical doctor, even goes so far as to claim that facial characteristics, you look like the previous person. That people look similarly. You can identify facial characteristics from lifetime to lifetime. He doesn't think it happens every time, but it happens often enough that he's noticed it and built a big website just around that idea, and even gone so far, and perhaps it's a little too far, to try and identify people living today who were famous people in previous lifetimes because they look alike and act alike and have similar characteristics. I don't know that the science allows us yet to go that far, but Dr. Semke feels that it does, and he does his research working with, happens to be a good friend of mine, a trance channel, Kevin Ryerson, whom he described numerous instances of very accurate readings from Kevin that confirmed to him this. But all of that aside, the research of Ian Stevenson is one example. And I like to say, rather than look at any individual case, like many of you are probably familiar with the case of James Leininger, a young American child who had memories of being a World War II naval pilot. It's been a highly publicized case. Rather than look at any single case, which can be torn apart, I think it's better to look at the whole body. And that's really why I've created this diagram in my essay, because the best evidence is all the evidence taken together. Rather than, the thing is this, if you look at any single case, a clever person can tear apart any single case. It's easy to do if you have a good intellect. And a lot of very smart people make it their business to try and tear down individual cases. But when you see the whole pattern of all of this evidence at once, it's hard to tear apart, because it begins to make sense. For example, the relationship between the afterlife and dreams. It comes up in the reincarnation research, where many times the mother of a person of a newborn, while the newborn is still in the womb, or sometimes even before conception, will have what is called an announcing dream, where the soul of the spirit that wants to incarnate in that family will come and request. There's even a case I found in the records. It's not necessarily the best case, but it illustrates the relationship between the afterlife and dreams. A case from Burma in which a village headman named Ubakyar had been murdered. And He was close to a particular family, and the wife of the family, her husband is out of town on a visit somewhere. The wife of the family has a dream in which Ubakyar comes and says, I'd like to be reborn into your family. And in the dream, the wife says to him, oh no, I don't think it's a good idea. You are such a rich, important person, and we are just humble people. You deserve much better than us. So, no. And the husband was out of town, but when he returns, the wife tells him about the dream, and he says, he said, I had a dream the same night. Ubakyar came to me. He said, I want to be reborn in your family, but your wife said I can't. And the husband said, oh no, you're our good friend, you can. Well, a young child was born into that family. Ong Thong was his Burmese name. And he was born with certain deformities that corresponded to what they believe were the death wounds of Ubakyar. It was a very difficult situation. I don't think I'll go into all the details. There were insurgents. They came in, they kidnapped the mayor. One of the insurgents was a villager himself who had run into a conflict with Ubakyar, who had accused him of criminal behavior, and then he ran off and joined the insurgents, came back, they kidnapped the mayor and killed him, cut off his hands. The young boy was born without hands. Throughout his whole life, he insisted he was Ubakyar, and when he encountered in the village the man who he believed had murdered Ubakyar, the same person who had been accused of being a criminal by Ubakyar before he had been kidnapped and murdered, he came up to him because that person was now living in the village, started beating on him and saying, look what you've done to me. So there's a lot of emotion associated with these cases that at the emotional level are extremely compelling, but how do you explain some of that in scientific terms? It's difficult because we're dealing with phenomena that individually you could say, the kid was just nuts. There's no proof. We don't know for sure how Ubakyar died in any case. All we know is he was kidnapped and they never found his body. I find the dream story extremely compelling, and the relationship between lucid dreams in particular and the afterlife, well, it's something that the great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung wrote about extensively. In his Red Book, for example, he records many of his dreams that involve contact with the dead. And he doesn't say, I had a dream about a dead person. He writes in a way that suggests something more real. He said, I was visited by my father in the dream. Didn't say I had a dream about my father. So if you read Carl Jung carefully, you'll see that within the community of depth psychology and depth psychiatry, there's an extraordinary overlap between an understanding of the afterlife and an understanding of our own inner psyche. I tend to think of the human psyche as being a universe of its own. I think we're at a point in time in history today very similar to what life must have been like 500-600 years ago, when the explorers from Europe were just reaching out and discovering whole new continents. And that's what we're doing with the thousands of accounts of reincarnation, the thousands of accounts of near-death experience that we're gathering, the work that's being done in-depth meditation, hypnotic regression, work with mediums, the numerous reports of xenoglossy, which is people who can speak languages that they never learned. cases of possession. There's more than I can go into now with all the details, but during the question section, I will be happy to go into further depth answering your questions. But at this point in time, I'd like to bring Eben up to the stage with me. I know we can have an interesting discussion about some of the theoretical issues behind this, some of the social issues.
Very well done.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Beautiful. Yes, well, let's chat a little bit. Well, I can certainly attest as a former materialist-oriented neuroscientist, neurosurgeon, that having a personal experience absolutely changed my life. And I think one of the most amazing things after spending a week in coma due to a severe case of meningitis that should have killed me, coming back to this world with a brain that was still quite wrecked by the experience, but then recovering over 2 months fully in a way that medical science really cannot explain, is just kind of the beginning of kind of the healing and wholeness that is implied by this kind of connection that we have with the spiritual world. And it really is much more power than our culture in general will allow. But I must say, I was absolutely taken with your essay. And I highly recommend that everyone here read BigelowInstitute.org, Jeffrey Mishlove's essay. And what you'll find is it's very compelling evidence. And as he says, it's this bundle, all the facts. And as a neuroscientist, for me, what that implied was the consilience of evidence, for example, from quantum physics, which implies very strongly that consciousness is something that's fundamental and not derivative from the brain. But combine that with the extreme challenge in neuroscience of trying to understand anything about how conscious awareness comes into being. And for any materialist scientist who claims, the brain creates consciousness, you then find that there's tremendous evidence that it does not. And then, of course, there is all the evidence for non-local consciousness out of parapsychology, which is just overwhelming, and you elucidate a lot of that. From my point of view, I think one of the big challenges in science, because the scientists who study consciousness are now very much kind of on board with your position. They realize that the materialist model clearly doesn't work at all, that the idea that only the physical universe exists and that the brain creates consciousness is absolutely false. But then, once you've admitted that there's something very real and concrete to this mental aspect, and that the mental seems to actually have power over controlling the physical world, the discussion still kind of dissolves into comparing true survival versus what might be called super psi, or the other argument that basically it's just telepathy among the living. So that, in other words, this kind of story, you could explain it just by telepathic communication, that people can read other people's minds and might therefore get that information that appears to be survival of a soul. How would you say is the best way to kind of engage that argument of super psi versus true survival?
The funny thing is this. People in parapsychology typically hold that argument, and a few people in philosophy who are sympathetic to parapsychology. But the scientific community, by and large, still doesn't even accept telepathy.
Right.
They don't accept clairvoyance. They don't accept precognition. They don't accept psychokinesis. So the fallback position is that, we can't prove survival after death, but we can prove and have enormous experimental, double-blind, controlled studies showing the existence of telepathy, precognition, and mind over matter. So many parapsychologists will say, we'd love to be able someday in the future to prove that survival exists, but for the time being, will settle for the proof of ESP and what we call PK, or psychokinesis, but the problem is that's not even accepted by mainstream science yet, even though the Parapsychological Association, which studies these things, has been an affiliate of the American Association for the Advancement of Science since 1969. So they're doing good scientific work, but we live in a scientific community is very different than the community at large. The statistics have shown that belief in an afterlife amongst the American population has been over 70% consistently now for the last 70 years, even though religious affiliation is dropping. Belief in the afterlife isn't dropping, which suggests to me that it's because people like those of you who raised your hands in this room are having these experiences. But I'm a little less optimistic than you about the general acceptance of even the consciousness research community, because I had a personal experience recently. After winning the Bigelow Award, I was invited to give what I took to be the opening night keynote at a major conference on consciousness. In fact, it's about to begin in 2 weeks in Tucson. The invitation was withdrawn after one of their financial sponsors, even though the conference organizer is a good friend of mine and very open to these things, one of their financial sponsors said, belief in the afterlife, it's all anecdotal. We can't have that at a scientific conference on consciousness. And throughout history, there's been this pecking order going on in science. I say, why is it after 40 years I'm still the only person with a doctoral diploma in parapsychology? And who are the most resistant? It's the psychologists.
Right.
Up until recently, although in 2018, even the American Psychologist, the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association, published a major article summarizing over 1,400 experiments in parapsychology that provide massive proof of the existence of psychic phenomena. Yet you won't find parapsychology taught in maybe less than 1% of American universities. So I think things are opening up slowly. I mean, your book has had millions of readers. I've had millions of viewers on the New Thinking Aloud channel on YouTube. I encourage everybody here to subscribe, incidentally. But there's a real pressure to overcome the grip that materialism as a metaphysical principle has on our culture. And to be honest, it's resulting not only in an enormous battle for the minds of people in science and in philosophy, but look what materialism, which I enjoy, I love material things, but what is it doing to the planet? And what is it doing when someone like Vladimir Putin just says, doesn't matter how many people I killed if I can get what I want.
Well, I think that's the real tragedy, is this kind of false sense of separation that comes with materialist thought. I mean, it's right there in reductive materialism, the notion that you're just dealing with separate objects and want to define the rules that define their engagement and understand it as a bottom-up kind of causality. And what I think quantum physics introduces to the whole concept is this notion of really one mind, a mental universe, top-down causality that governs all of the events. And a very simple example in kind of medical science is placebo effect and spontaneous remissions, and then miraculous healing and near-death experiences. It shows a progressive kind of increase in the ability of mind to influence matter in a very practical way. I mean, our health is something important to all of us. And when you start to realize how much power mind can have over your health, which, of course, medical science has acknowledged for more than 6 decades, using placebo effect as the gold standard for any new treatment modality. But what it's really instructing us about is that the mental layer of the universe, kind of a layer of information assimilation and integration, is one that we all have access to as sentient beings. But we're really sharing the one mind. I think that is a concept that several of the Bigelow essays pointed to. I know Pim van Lommel, who won the second place award, made a big point of the kind of one mind notion towards the end of his paper. Do you think we're at all close to having this kind of revolution rescue us from the toxicity of materialism and an impending a lot of disaster possible if materialism and the current status quo just go on unabated?
Many years ago, I interviewed Michael Grosso, a philosopher, and he pointed out something very interesting, that at the same time that all these near-death experiences are becoming public, that all this research up here is becoming public, humanity is also at a point that we've never been at before in human history, where we have the capability of destroying all life, or certainly all human life on this planet. It's as if at a global level, we're facing the possibility of a near-death experience for the species. And so these mystical experiences are coming to the fore more and more, and it's a race in a way to see, can we wake up before we destroy ourselves? Mm-hmm.
Well, I believe that's what's going on. I think this is kind of the culmination of more than 5,000 years of human history, where we're facing a challenge. And in many ways, it's like in the world of addiction, alcoholism studies, things like that, you find the value in something called a gift of desperation, where you get to such a low level that it's either you're going to use the energy of the darkness of that experience to bounce up and start recovering from the addiction, or you're going to succumb to it. And I would say in many ways, our world is at that kind of a juncture, and I'm actually very optimistic, because I believe that the work that you do, that was raised by the Bigelow group, that has been followed by many scientists of consciousness for decades, if not centuries, is actually leading to a way forward. But it seems to be just in the nick of time, and it will involve everyone coming to realize that materialism and the notion that the brain creates consciousness, the notion that our existence is birth to death and nothing more, is a myth. It is not true. And that there is a tremendous amount of evidence for the reality of this kind of mental layer of the universe that we have access to. And that's why dreams and the afterlife, psychedelic experiences, they're all kind of leading into the same territory that, from my point of view, is maximally revealed in a spontaneous NDE. A big question would be, is there a way that we can somehow induce a similar state, or help people in meditation or centering prayer to get deeply into the kind of territory that would give them the evidence for this that you obtain, for example, in an NDE?
Well, it's one of the reasons I put up 4 videos every week,
right,
to try and just get the conversation going as widely as possible. I think of it as a race. You know, there's something called the Fermi Paradox in astronomy, which is considering that we have every good reason to believe that there are billions of planets in this galaxy, in the Milky Way galaxy, that could sustain human life. Why haven't we heard from them more? Now, we could go into that. That's a lengthy conversation, but astronomers will say we are not picking up their radio or television signals. And so people speculate that maybe the reason is that once you become an intelligent species where you have technology and civilization, it's very short-lived. You destroy yourselves, and all the other intelligent species that we might communicate with have already destroyed themselves. And I can well imagine that in a universe of billions of planets like ours, some of them really did destroy themselves. They're not all going to survive. And whether we do or not is still, to me, it's an open question. But like you, I'm optimistic as well. It's just sort of instinctive for me.
Well, I agree, and my optimism is deeply kind of related to my own personal experience, and then the 13 years since that time, working with other scientists around the world to help understand this and kind of illuminate this grander reality that involves so much more than the physical world. And I would think from that point, some people are kind of falsely assume that these kind of experiences, afterlife experiences of NDEs, after-death communications, deathbed visions, the reincarnation memories in children, that all of this kind of evidence is very strong in supporting this bigger picture. And the scientific community is now really, I would say, rising to the occasion. I mean, for example, when I look out at University of Virginia, and Ed Kelly's books, which I highly recommend to anyone who is interested in this field, but they go very, very deep. But it started with Irreducible Mind back in 2008, 800 pages of dense kind of scientific evidence for the reality of kind of this one mind, this mental layer. And then in 2015, Beyond Physicalism, another extraordinary book that took next levels of kind of understanding. And then finally, last spring, his book, Consciousness Unbound. And yet it's all very deep. I think your essay does a beautiful job of kind of bringing it into a level of understanding that most people can really benefit from. But this whole notion that science does not allow for this, I think we're finally moving beyond that with groups like the Galileo Commission, the Scientific and Medical Network in England. But, I mean, you've witnessed this for more than a half century now, this incredible resistance among modern, well-read, intellectual people who are serious about understanding the world. What is the holdup?
I think it goes against a sort of common sense. Like most people here in the room, we go about our daily life imagining that we are inside our body rather than that our body is inside of us. As you pointed out, Max Planck, the founder of quantum physics, said consciousness is fundamental. You can't get underneath it. I believe that matter is created by consciousness, by which he meant mind at large, not individual egos. Mm-hmm. But most of us don't experience that in our daily life. We experience this as a solid table, even though, for example, physicists will tell us it's all mostly 99.99 empty space. Mm-hmm. It's not solid at all, but we're wired, our brains are wired to imagine that what we experience through our senses is real, and what we experience inwardly is less real. So if we say we don't understand something, we say it doesn't make sense. Or if something is unimportant to us, we say it's immaterial. Right. It's like ingrained in our language even.
The whole word reality is from the Latin word for things, reus. So obviously there's a prejudice built into our language and a lot of our thinking. Another issue, of course, is people think, well, if we've had these past lives, why don't we remember them? Mm-hmm. But of course, as Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson will tell you, by age 5 or 6, those memories are being covered over by natural processes. And then there's also what's known as the amnesia of childhood, mm-hmm. so that it's kind of like the universe is conspiring against our remembering between lives and past lives and all of that. I believe, from my perspective as having gone through an NDE, that is really all about having skin in the game, buying into this, because this is how we kind of learn and grow. And if we had all the knowledge of our higher soul, of all our previous lifetimes and everything, we would side dance around what we're supposed to go through here in terms of learning and growth. I think it would probably be a good idea to open it up to the audience. I can imagine we haven't answered all questions about this, and there probably are some good ones out there.
Thank you both. So I will bring the microphone around if you raise your hand, and I'll tell you to keep this mic close to your mouth like this. Don't turn anything on or off. I know there will be more questions than we have time for, so I'll ask you to try to keep your questions concise. I know many of you probably have stories and experiences. We don't have time for those tonight, so try to keep it to a question, and I'll say to you, try to keep your answers concise so we can get to as many questions as possible. So, who's got the first question?
Can an animal serve as a median between like a past father and his son, sending a message?
I would say animals often serve as mediums. In fact, there are certain species that are very commonly viewed as messengers, like hummingbirds, butterflies, dragonflies, owls. I mean, the list goes on. So I would say when we're talking about consciousness in this kind of discussion, it is not limited to human consciousness. Now, we're able to kind of share our kind of contents of consciousness with our fellow beings, but that does not mean that animals cannot have a very rich, kind of engaging, kind of spiritual connection with this universe. One little story that comes to mind in my own family is just with the death of a man, an uncle in my biological family, and this little yappy dog that his widow had, who always barked and yapped when anyone came to the door. But when they brought Roy's ashes, the funeral home, and rang the doorbell, the little dog didn't bark or yap one little bit. Knew it was, Roy was coming home. And you find another example, I would say, is certain hospice centers that I've had communication with and worked with use cats. Cats that seem to have kind of a spiritual awareness who will they know who the next soul is that's going to pass, and so they'll go in that room. So I think that kind of answers your question, that animals are richly involved in this kind of spiritual universe, in this one mind that we're talking about.
If I can just answer briefly as well, I won't go into detail, but Congressman Jamie Raskin has just written a book called Unthinkable. You may know that his son died from suicide just a few days before the January 6th insurrection. And in his book, the very last chapter, the very ending, is a story in which a flock of birds came to him and provided to him a message that his son was still alive. So if you want a wonderful example, check out that book.
Hello. Have either of you ever recreated or gotten close to the state that you were in through breath work or microdosing or some other way of getting there?
Well, I can certainly comment that from my point of view, meditation is the way. And that's what I've written about a lot, like the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. It was co-written with my life partner, Karen Newell. We discuss a lot of that. In fact, I discuss how I had a very specific encounter with my adoptive father, his soul. He had passed over 4 years before my coma, and yet in my NDE, he was nowhere to be found. If I had scripted it, he would have been there. But anyone who's read Proof of Heaven will realize I had a different spiritual guide. It turned out to be a biological sister that I'd never known because I was adopted. There's a lot to that story I won't go into. But when I encountered him in meditation, it was this very profound kind of connection where his sense of humor came through in a way. He even kind of told me he could not be a parent to me during my NDE because if he had been, I would have been more tempted in spite of a 1 in 10 million diagnosis of E. coli bacterial meningitis in an adult, in spite of 1 in a billion recovery. If it had been him, I would have been a little more tempted to think, you see who you want to see on the way out. That's why I had to see someone who is completely different and yet a very deep kind of soul connection to me because of our adoptive family history, even though she died 2 years before I even knew of her existence. But from my point of view, meditation is a beautiful way to return to that. And in fact, we share meditation workshops using sacred acoustics, which is a form of differential frequency brainwave entrainment that Karen and her business partner have provided to the world. But there's a lot more that can be said about things like psychedelics. I do not think, I think psychedelics give only a tiny itty-bitty glimpse through a keyhole. They don't give the full-blown kind of power of the spiritual experience, and that's why I think centering, prayer, meditation are much better ways to get to that, and really just explore the mental realm. You know, one thing we forget is this world around us is never anything more than a mental model that's being constructed. You've got a nervous system that filters information. Quantum physics itself is screaming at us that the physical world out there, objective physical world, does not exist independently of the observing mind. And that is the crucial lesson that science is now taking to the world. And it will empower us tremendously as human beings, in our own health and healing, and for society at large. But I think prayer and meditation, from my point of view, are far better ways to engage with that realm and to connect with souls of departed loved ones and all of that.
I agree.
Hi. So I just have a question for you. I think we talk about consciousness in terms of levels a lot.
Right.
And I think we talk about consciousness in terms of levels a lot, but I'm kind of curious about your guys' opinion on consciousness being more of a spectrum and being kind of more like just fluid rather than having strict levels. And if you guys have any opinions on that.
If I understood your question, you were talking about, is consciousness a spectrum? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, kind of like a spectrum rather than like with strict levels.
Well, I'm not sure I understand your question, but I can tell you from my point of view, if you were to think of consciousness as a spectrum, you could say it goes from heaven to hell. And in my opinion, all of it is within us, every bit.
All right, my question is, like the slogan, Heaven on Earth,
Can you speak louder?
We can't hear.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, my question is the connection between heaven and reincarnation. Because in my heart, I want to believe that I'm going to go to heaven, I'm going to see my mom and dad and all the people that I have gone before me that I love. But when we talk about reincarnation, does that mean then I don't get to see them again? Or does it mean that heaven really is on earth? And that maybe they'll be with me in a different body of somebody else, but they're with me? I don't know. Explain that to me.
Well, I think an important concept here, something I often talk about in my presentations, is the notion of what I call deep time. And that is, if you pay attention to life reviews that have been discussed with near-death experiences going back at least 2,400 years in history, and they occur across all cultures, probably somewhere between 25 and 50%, the life review is not just described as some vague memory of the events of one's life. It's often described as a reliving of those events. So in other words, the point I'm making is that when our mind is expanded enough to be in this kind of realm, the NDE realm that we're talking about, that is, it allows for you to realize that the events of this world are in many ways kind of a fiction that is set up to allow the drama to unfold. The fact that the universe can show us in such a beautiful fashion the major events of a life that we relive, and not only that, we experience it from the emotional perspective of those around us. So a life review is really kind of this one mind, sharing the dream of the one mind and seeing it. And so what that is demonstrating is that our notion of time and time flow in this world is very primitive and incomplete compared to deep time. Deep time allows a presentation of the most important aspect of all this. It's not evolution of one soul, because all of us are in this together. And that's why life reviews involve this kind of non-self-boundary version of kind of a shared reality. And so the important message here is about relationships. It's all about those interactions with other beings and what we've learned and taught in those experiences. And this notion of deep time is what allows for us to realize a loved one would never reincarnate before their responsibility to be there for us when we pass over. And also, I believe that all of this discussion is about not just our evolution as individual beings, because it's never individual. Again, it's about the group, the collective, the relationships, growing and teaching and learning together. It's the transformation of all of consciousness throughout the cosmos, as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin wrote about in his book, The Phenomenon of Man. But that is very comforting. Near-death experiences, deathbed visions. If you read the hospice work, for example, of Dr. Kerr, Kerr, who wrote the book recently, Heaven is But a Dream. Excellent book on terminal events in people's lives in hospice work. It's all the same. It shows loved ones coming back to escort us over. It's all about relationships, and that one would never reincarnate, before serving that responsible purpose of reuniting in that space with the loved ones to then plan a next incarnation. So I hope that answers your question.
I have a question about the work involved in getting to your level of awareness. I'm a regular person. I don't consider myself particularly sensitive, more sensitive than anybody else. I don't remember my dreams. I'm very interested in what you're saying. Can I achieve greater awareness by meditation and prayer, or does it just happen to people? It didn't seem like you guys tried to experience what you did. Does it just happen to certain people, or do you have to really work at it?
I wouldn't call it work. I call it play. But to answer your question, I think fundamentally, yes, the answer is by going into the mental space. Once you realize your mental space can incorporate the entire universe through all of eternity. Your mental space is gigantic compared to any kind of physical space. Well, that's what I'm getting to. And the very simple, given we don't have a ton of time, I'll tell you the ego is your problem, is everyone's problem here. That running stream of thoughts in the head. So many people identify with that and say, that's who I am. But in fact, your kind of soul and your soul connections is a much bigger you that is there. And for me, in meditation, when we're teaching people to just get started, the simple lesson is to teach them that little running stream of thoughts in your head, all your memories, your whole life, kind of the way you put it together, that is not who you are deeply. And you can get beyond that. I call that just kind of the ego mind, the linguistic brain. And so meditation involves getting to a state of a much broader kind of conscious awareness. And really the simplest way to start getting there is by putting that little voice into timeout, the voice in your head. And you can easily do that in meditation by stating an intention at the beginning. And of course the little ego voice can state an intention, make a request, but then it goes into timeout. And that's where, for example, I think any mode people have for meditating and being able to become this kind of bigger consciousness than that ego mind is very valuable. I just personally have found that my partner's work, and that, full disclosure, she's my partner, and I'm still supporting her work here, but it's very good work. In fact, I encouraged her to make the company Sacred Acoustics. So people who want to learn more, sacredacoustics.com. It involves differential frequency brainwave entrainment and an impact on circuits in the lower brainstem. Don't have time to go into all the mechanism, but it's a very different way of experiencing consciousness. Just learning to ride those tones once you start with the lesson of putting your little ego voice into timeout.
So, Dr. Alexander, I have a very quick question. I read your book, Proof of Heaven. I think I'm one of the rare beings on this planet that I watch CNN and Fox News. So I'm always trying to read the other side. I've read a bunch of the attacks on your book, Proof of Heaven. And they fall into two categories: ad hominem, you've read them, I'm not going to regurgitate them, or scientific. Maybe he had dopamigenic, endorphinogenic pathways going on. And I keep going back to the following answer when I sort of debate this, and I suspect you have a better answer than mine. My answer is the guy didn't give himself bacterial meningitis to put himself in a coma with no brain activity for a week just to write a book.
That's very logical. Thank you for pointing that out.
But I always sense that maybe if I had you in a room, your answer would also have a secondary, more profound truth than than what I'm fighting back against these attacks on you.
I'm sorry, I missed that last part.
Yeah, how would you answer those attacks? Because I have a feeling, having been in the NDE for a week, your answer is going to be much more profound.
Well, the simplest answer, it depends heavily on the case report that was written on my medical records. It was by 3 physicians who were not involved in my care. It was written 10 years after my coma. Now, I thought I'd gone through my medical records enough so that the medical details I gave in Proof of Heaven, the appendices, etc., made a pretty clear case that my brain could not have done that, could not have manufactured anything but the most rudimentary little trickle of awareness, much less the most extraordinary, memorable, detailed, meaningful, powerful, life-transforming event ever in my experience. And it all happened when my brain was demonstrably offline. And that's what's made so clear in the case report. Now, the second thing they make crystal clear is that my full recovery is a medical miracle. And that's one thing that, if people don't have medical training, they're not necessarily going to pick that up. But if you, read the case report, read Bruce Grayson's chapter 10 in his book After, which is pretty much devoted to my case, you start realizing these miracles. They were good enough to get in the Bible way back in the olden days. Why don't we pay attention to medical miracles today? And the medical miracle, because in fact, when that case report was submitted to the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases by Serbi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Bruce Grayson back in 2018, the medical case reviewers said, wait a minute, this case is absurd. That's the word they use. They said, no one is ever this sick, 7-day coma from severe bacterial meningoencephalitis, who then ends up having a full recovery. So how do you explain that? And the 3 doctors said, well, it's because he had a near-death experience. That's what enabled him to have a kind of a spiritual journey that would empower that kind of healing that goes beyond Western medical expectation. And the peer reviewer said, good enough for us, and published it. So I think in a nutshell, that's kind of it. And mine's not alone. There are many other cases of NDEs with absolutely inexplicable healing. Anita Morjani, her lymphoma disappearing after she had an NDE, and she was told in the NDE that the cancer would go away. Or Dr. Mary C. Neal, the orthopedic surgeon, more than 30-minute warm water drowning during a kayaking accident in Chile. You don't recover from that. It doesn't happen. And yet she did. They pulled her out of the water dead. They resuscitated her. But any physician will tell you 30 minutes under warm water doesn't leave you with anything but kind of a liquid brain. It doesn't think well, and you don't survive. So these kind of miracles are what you pay attention to. And, the rest is just my trying to be honest about what it is, what it means, how it's changed my life. Ken Ring wrote decades ago. He was one of the founding fathers of the International Association of Near-Death Studies. And he wrote about how just knowing about NDEs can help people transform their own lives in the same direction. So you don't have to have an NDE. Exploring consciousness, prayer, meditation, these ways of really kind of engaging with the universe on those larger scales is a beautiful gift, and it enables us to have power over our lives. So thank you for that question, though. It comes up, in fact, the third place winner, Leo Rookby, goes into a pretty extensive analysis of the attacks on my case and explains why they're absolutely ridiculous and make no sense, and why did anybody ever believe any of those attacks given the known facts. But anyway, it's part of the world.
Hi, I have about 2 questions. So one is, how much time for reincarnation from the time someone dies to the time that these kids are saying that they are like the person that died? So what's the time, days or years? And then the other question is, can you give more examples of what you experienced during that 1 week of your coma, like who visited you, and some more details on that?
You want to?
Oh, I'll take the first half.
Yeah. You might have to read the book for the second half. Not that I'm trying to sell your books.
You're exactly right. I mean, it would take a while to get into it.
That tonight, so.
Yeah.
But
the first half of the data is it does seem to be culturally dependent. In Eastern cases, that is in Asia, sometimes it's just a few months. In Western cases, like the Leininger case, it can be decades. So I think there's a lot of variation. I also don't think everybody has to reincarnate. I think you have some free will involved in whether you choose to come back or not.
Yeah, I would just point out, in addition to that answer, is remember what I said about the life reviews, and that aspect of the universe is outside of our perception of time in an earthly sense. For example, I in Proof of Heaven, I talked about a terminal lucidity case. It happened to a very close friend of mine. He happened to be chairman of one of the top neurosurgical programs on Earth. He was a staunch materialist, like I had been before my coma. And I had a conversation with him about 2 years after my coma because of something inexplicable in his life when he was there with his own father, who was dying. And the father had an experience of his own mother, that would be the grandmother of my friend, who he had been with as a 14-year-old 65 years earlier when she died during the Holocaust in a concentration camp. But the interesting thing is that reunion was as if not 1 second of time had passed. And my friend was absolutely shocked by the reality of witnessing his father relating to the spirit of the mother. Even though my friend could not see her spirit, he was absolutely convinced she was there because of what he saw in his father, who had never talked about her over 65 years because of the painful memories. And yet here on his deathbed, he's having this beautiful reunion, very engaged, happy, joyous, blissful reunion. And that's how he left this world. And that's why they come back to help us cross, is because love is ultimately the answer. I'm sorry, I don't have time to answer your second question. There's a lot to it. That's why I wrote a book about it.
Thank you very much for being here. Is this better? All right. In my research, I have discovered something called laminin. It's a glycoprotein. And this glycoprotein is who we are. There's about 60 to 90 glycoproteins in every human body. Your heart, your mind, your optical nerve, your skin, everything is being perfectly built and scaffolding with these glycoproteins called laminin. My question is, we were speaking of a frequency like the Planckian frequency and the connection to the afterlife in the confirmation of this spiritual connection. Could the laminin be the living antenna of God in our bodies for your spontaneous healing, near-death experience? Could it be the gateway to the psychosis or the psychic realm that gives us the ability to communicate to different entities or personages? I've had a personal experience. I won't go into it. It has changed my life. But my question is, could the laminin of our own body be the living antenna to our spiritual growth?
Well, I'd have to know a lot more about laminin than I do to answer that question. But I've often thought that DNA actually serves as a transceiver. Thank you. Thank you very much. Given that 98.5% of DNA seems to be junk, that is, it doesn't seem to serve the kind of protein transcription that we normally attribute to DNA. So we obviously seem to have a very limited understanding of all that DNA does. But I've often thought, especially with some of the evidence about the dimensions of DNA and how it can serve as a spintronic filter for electron states and quantum states, that it would serve going beyond the discussion of, say, microtubules in the brain that are thought to preserve quantum states long enough so that they can participate in consciousness. I think that the kind of healing that I went through is much more of an effect, not of quantum, of the kind of mental layer on the quantum effects within microtubules of the brain, which would only have to do with conscious awareness, but actually has to do with healing the body. So that, in other words, the DNA would be the transceiver. I'll have to learn a little more about this. I'll do some homework and get back to you.
So I'd like to give you both a chance to say whatever else you want to say. We've got just a few minutes, and then I have some closing words. So let's start with you, Jeff.
Well, Eben earlier said, and I agree with him completely, the bottom line is it's all about love. And I think it would be good to remember that, to say it in as many different ways as possible. Someone asked me yesterday, what lesson have I learned from 50 years of studying in this field? And it was kind of glib. It sounds like some unbelievable statement that you can just say but doesn't have any meaning. And I said, the message is love everybody and everything all of the time. Now, I know I can't do that. I even struggle loving everybody all the time, let alone everything all of the time. But I'm convinced that that's the goal that I'm working towards. And even though I'm far from being there, I think that that's the ultimate message that comes from our understanding of afterlife experiences and the people who have them.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, certainly from having had a near-death experience and then from having talked with, met, discussed similar experiences with thousands of other people who have had them, it's clear to me that that is the message. That is what happens when people leave the physical plane, deathbed visions, after-death communications, all of that hospice work that doesn't even get into afterlife at all, but is all about how souls seem to come back when a soul is transitioning from this world to offer comfort, to offer reassurance of kind of progress, all through love, the binding force of love. And that is what I think is going to be a tremendous gift to this world as this science of consciousness, because that's exactly what we're talking about here. And there are hundreds of scientists around the world who are on board with exactly this kind of work that Jeffrey epitomizes so beautifully in his work. But they're there. Galileo Commission, Scientific and Medical Network, there are groups of scientists around the world who are working together to help bring this knowledge to the world. Once you realize that spiritual journeys like NDEs are not just imagination, but they point to a realm that's more real and fundamental than this one, this world will start paying attention to it and realizing we're here to take care of each other. It's all about kindness, compassion, mercy, acceptance, when necessary, forgiveness. But ultimately, this revolution will save the planet, and it will save all of us, but we can all participate. It's a beautiful gift because, in fact, I was doing an interview yesterday where someone who seemed to me to be quite a seeker was kind of expressing some frustration at coming to any kind of real sense of meaning and purpose in his journey. And I said, well, this is a journey of all of us. So if you're looking at it as your soul and your soul's journey, you're never going to get anywhere. It's about all of us. That's about love and connection and taking care of each and every one of us. And that is ultimately the lesson that will come from us. From this discussion, this scientific investigation, this sharing of experience. And that's why I encourage everyone who has had this kind of spiritual experience to share it, talk about it. Scientists support you in it. They don't refute you. And it's time for this world to grow up. So
I'd like to thank you both. Let's give them a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You want to say something?
Thank you all so much. And I would simply like to publicly express my gratitude to Jeffrey Mishlove, who for 50 years plus has been really swimming against the tide to bring this kind of knowledge to the world. And I think the Bigelow Institute essays. There are 29 of them. I encourage you to read all. You'll see a tremendous variety of approaches to this, but you will see why the judges, who were very well chosen for this role, picked Jeffrey's paper. And in fact, I would say that when the history of this kind of revolution in human understanding is written, that Jeffrey Mishlove will figure very prominently as a catalyst for that change. So Jeffrey, thank you.
Well,
thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Evan. And
Let's give them.
It's an honor to share the stage with you.
Well, thank you.